Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast. Today, we are undertaking a truly profound deep dive. We're going into what is arguably the most disruptive critique of Western morality ever written, Friedrich Nietzsche's 1887 masterpiece on the genealogy of morality. This book it's a stack of dynamite, really. It's waiting to explode every single assumption you have about good and evil.
And it's funny you say that because even though it's so systematic in its investigation, he actually thought of it as just a small polemical pamphlet.
Just a little something to toss out there.
Exactly. A quick, aggressive piece to, make his earlier, much tougher philosophy a bit more accessible. But the ideas in it, well, they're absolutely central to understanding the whole trajectory of modern European thought.
Right. And to really get into it, I think it helps to understand who Nietzsche was. Because his approach is not what you'd call a typical philosopher's.
Not at all. He was the son of a Protestant clergyman, which probably explains a lot.
You think. His later obsession with just surgically tearing down Christian moral frameworks?
It has to be related. But the key thing, the crucial part of his background, is that his formal training wasn't in theology. It was in philology.
The rigorous historical study of classical texts and languages.
And that training is the absolute key to his entire method. It's what allowed him to trace the evolution of concepts, to look at a word like guilt or good and treat it not as some timeless, Platonic ideal.
But as a historical artifact.
A linguistic artifact, yeah. Separating all the theological baggage from what he called moral prejudices. We see this instinct in him very early on.
Like in his essay, The Greek State.
Exactly, which has these incredibly provocative political ideas. That was originally meant to be a chapter in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, back in 1872.
And even before the genealogy, the sources show he'd been wrestling with this problem of morality for, over a decade?
At least. In his work Human, All Too Human, from '76, he had already laid out the provisional thoughts on where moral prejudices come from. It was there that he first started sketching out this idea that good and evil had this dual prehistory.
Right, that they existed separately, one for the nobles, one for the slaves, a concept he would later just dramatically and, violently expand on in this book.
So he's fundamentally a radical historian of concepts.
So our mission today is really to unpack these central, deeply unsettling arguments of the genealogy. We're going to try to show you why everything you thought about good and evil might actually be, in his view, a dangerous trick, a system of incorporated errors, and we'll trace the specific twisted history of how concepts like good, evil, and especially guilt were, as he puts it, invented and then deployed by the weakest among us. Moving into the first part of our deep dive, then, you have to acknowledge that just reading Nietzsche is an experience in itself.
Well, absolutely. It's not like reading a traditional systematic treatise. His writing presents this immediate stylistic challenge. It sets him apart from, standard academic philosophy.
The kind of work he sort of sneeringly called the output of philosophical workers.
He consciously avoided that, the heavy, linear academic style. His method relies so heavily on aphorisms and these very literary forms. It was all designed deliberately to energize and enliven philosophical style. He wasn't just presenting ideas, he was trying to electrify you as you read them.
And he gets this tone by mixing the sacred and the profane, doesn't he? The serious and the playful.
That's his ideal. He has this paradoxical phrase. It's a parody of a line from Horace. Ridendo dicere severum.
Which means?
Saying what is somber through what is laughable. He uses humor, irony, sarcasm, but not to soften the message. He uses them to make the deadly serious arguments stick, to keep you constantly off balance.
Which is why he demands a certain attitude from you, the reader. He lays out what he calls a hermeneutic task.
The art of interpretation, or Auslegung. He's very explicit that an aphorism isn't deciphered just by being read quickly.
You can't just skim it.
You can't.
Yeah.
He suggests that for real understanding, what's required is rumination.
Like a cow chewing its cud.
Literally, that's the image. He's saying you need to digest the material slowly, reflectively, process the density of the ideas over time. It's a direct challenge to our modern tendency for, quick consumption and easy answers.
And the easiest answer of all, the one he spends his life trying to destroy, is this belief in an objective, eternal morality.
That's the core of it. He argues that morality, as we in the West understand it, is fundamentally a system of errors. And it's rooted in a profound self-ignorance about our own nature and our origins.
That's the core critique. He'd already summarized the roots of this self-ignorance, this moral confusion, in what he called the four errors that have educated humankind. He laid them out in The Gay Science.
And these are not minor mistakes. For him, they are the very pillars of our current human predicament.
So let's unpack those four errors because they really do define the scope of his entire project. The first one is our incomplete self-perception.
We lack true self-knowledge. We only see ourselves partially. Through all these layers of interpretation and habit, we fail to grasp the deep underlying drives and instincts that actually motivate us.
We're just operating on this thin layer of conscious thought, ignoring this vast, subterranean reality of our will.
And the second error flows right from that. We give ourselves fictitious attributes.
Because we don't know ourselves, we just invent things about ourselves.
Exactly. Concepts like the free, neutral subject that somehow stands apart from its actions, or the idea of an immaterial soul that's the origin of morality. We create these fictional causes for our actions. It gives us comfort, but it blinds us to the real, often uncomfortable, physiological and historical causes.
Okay, and third, we put ourselves in a false rank in relation to nature and animals.
We see ourselves as inherently superior, right? Separated from the brute force of the natural world with this unique, elevated status. And that separation prevents us from accepting our own dynamic, animalistic, life-affirming drives.
And the final error, which is the most immediate one for the genealogy, ties it all back to morality.
It's that we invent these new tables of what is good, and this is the key part. We then accept them as eternal and unconditional truths. We assume they represent some kind of knowledge we just don't possess. We mistake a contingent historical invention for a metaphysical certainty.
So if these errors are the foundation of civilization, what's Nietzsche's goal in pointing them out? Is he just trying to make us feel guilty?
Not at all. His objective isn't to accuse the past or induce guilt for these errors. He admits they provided necessary social stability and even new drives. Rather, he wants to urge us to strive to be more just in our evaluations of life by thinking beyond good and evil. He sees these moral prejudices as the main insidious obstacle to achieving a higher form of human existence, one that embraces life instead of denying it.
This critique gets incredibly intense when he starts talking about the immediate danger of modern morality. He describes it in these terrifying, almost apocalyptic terms.
He sees modern morality, especially this blend of Christian and utilitarian ideas, as a menacing and dangerous system. He thinks it allows the present generation, the contemporary, domesticated European, to live at the expense of the future. His concern is existential. This system threatens to prevent the human species from ever reaching its highest potential and splendor.
It's like a ceiling placed on what humanity can become.
A ceiling, exactly. And the specific goal of modern culture, as he diagnoses it, is so dangerous because it wants to eliminate conflict and risk. He defines this goal, in a very famous and provocative phrase, as to breed a tame and civilized animal, a household pet, out of the beast of prey, man.
Think about that analogy. The wild, powerful, risk-taking animal is being systematically turned into a comfortable, safe, domesticated pet.
And the result is that modern man is constantly trying to become better. But this betterment just means becoming more comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent, more Chinese, more Christian.
The implication is that this untamed, aggressive, expansive energy, the will to power, that's necessary for any truly great achievement, is being systematically neutered. It's channeled into just comfortable mediocrity.
This domestication is the great danger. It produces a person who thinks taming is an end in itself, which leads to this philosophical declaration that the end of struggle, the end of history has arrived.
He specifically warns about a new European type of Buddhism, right?
Yes, characterized by this supreme value placed on communal compassion, on eliminating suffering. This compassion, which he argues is just the latest form of pity and weakness, is mistakenly taken for morality itself, the only hope for the future.
Which brings us to his method for this critique, genealogy. He contrasts it directly with the historical methods of his contemporaries, especially the English psychologists like Paul Ray.
Right. He's engaging with that empiricist tradition from Locke and Hume, which trying to show that all this complex intellectual activity comes from fundamentally stupid processes.
Things like habit or just the random coupling of ideas.
And the English psychologists argued that morality came from actions that were initially just useful, and that the memory of why they were useful was later just forgotten.
And Nietzsche rejects this. He calls it English hypothesis mongering into the blue.
He wants a real history of morality. He found the English moralists too shallow. They only dealt with utility and adaptation, and they missed the profound underlying forces that actually shape concepts.
His distinction here is so critical, it's really the intellectual cornerstone of the whole book.
It is. He insists that the origin of a thing and its ultimate usefulness are toto kello separate.
Why the whole heaven's separate.
Exactly. The English moralists think utility creates a concept, and then the utility is forgotten. Nietzsche says utility, usefulness, purpose. That's the last thing you should look at in a thing's history, because those things are constantly changing.
So when we look at a hammer, we think its purpose is driving a nail.
But Nietzsche is saying, well, maybe initially it was used as a doorstop or a primitive weapon. To say the eye is made for seeing or the hand is made for grasping, that's the classic naive teleology he's attacking.
He argues that anything that exists is continually interpreted anew, transformed and redirected to a new purpose by superior power.
So the original meaning, sin and purpose, are necessarily obscured or just completely obliterated over time. Development isn't some logical progresses toward a final, perfect goal.
It's what? A chaotic mess.
A chaotic, aggressive succession of subjugations, reinterpretations, and conquests by dominant, forceful drives.
And this aggressive reinterpreting force is what he calls activity, the will to power.
That's the dynamic, expansive energy that shapes history. He accuses the democratic idiosyncrasy of the English psychologists of overlooking this crucial element. They prefer a passive model of just adapting to circumstances. He sees history as a battleground of forces, not a slow, gentle process of forgetting utility.
So, if utility is irrelevant to the origin, what does that mean for the future of our moral concepts? If a concept can just be repurposed and completely reinterpreted?
It means morality has no stable foundation. It's a tool, a weapon, a form of interpretation that's wielded by a dominant power.
And if we accept that, then we're ready to follow him as he applies this genealogical hammer to good and evil in the first essay. Okay, let's take that genealogical hammer to essay 1, where Nietzsche lays out the foundational conflict, the struggle between master and slave morality. This is where he really digs into the dual origin of the word good.
This is the central, pivotal concept of the genealogy. Nietzsche is asserting that the word good didn't just appear as some unified, universal term. It has two fundamentally different original meanings, and they correspond to the two groups that establish value in the first place.
Let's start with the first one, the noble valuation, or master morality. Where did this come from?
This morality just originated spontaneously, naturally, from the ruling aristocratic caste, the powerful, often conquering elites. These were the masters. They were characterized by their high spirits, their strength, their life-affirming power, and their definition of good was pure self-affirmation. Good was simply what they were. Good, noble, powerful, beautiful, safer. Happy, blessed.
It was an immediate, spontaneous judgment.
Absolutely. Because they were just overflowing with vitality and strength, their self-affirmation didn't need an external negative. They looked down on the low just because they were distant from them.
So their negative terms, low, common, bad, they were just pale afterthoughts, not objects of real hatred.
Exactly, just contrasting foils. This whole valuation is characterized by the pathos of nobility and distance, and it's driven by a powerful lust for mastery and aggressive activity. The nobleman, in the ancient Greek sense, equates happiness with action, eupratein, doing well, succeeding, asserting power.
Which is a sharp contrast to the kind of happiness sought by the powerless, which is passive.
Precisely. The happiness of the oppressed is the happiness of rest, peace, sedation, the Sabbath. It's an anesthetic against their suffering. Master morality is active. It's a creative affirmation of life in all its power.
And now we flip the script completely to the slave valuation. We're moving from spontaneous affirmation to corrosive reaction.
This slave valuation is entirely reactive. It's born not of power, but of deep impotence. It is driven by resentment.
He uses that French term, ressentiment, for a very specific reason.
Yes, to denote a long-term, entrenched, inwardly seething hatred and revengefulness felt by the oppressed and the powerless. It's not just casual resentment, it's a psychological poison.
So the slaves, because they're unable to act on their hatred for the masters, they just reject the whole noble equation.
They do. Through an act of most deliberate revenge, a process he credits the priestly caste, particularly the Jews, with pioneering. They bring about a radical revaluation of their values.
And the reversal is total. It defines morality for the next 2 millennia.
Absolutely. The slaves define the new moral landscape. Only those who suffer, those who are denied power and comfort, they're the ones who are truly good. The poor, the powerless, the lowly, the suffering, the deprived, the sick, and the ugly, These are the pious and saved.
And conversely, the rich, noble, and powerful are eternally wicked, cruel, and damned.
The slaves can only achieve this pale semblance of self-affirmation by observing that they are not like the evil masters.
So this is the mechanism of resentment as a creative force. It's the moralization of impotence.
Yes.
Tell us more about how this self-deception works. If the slave is powerless, how does he manage to build an entire moral universe out of that weakness?
Well, the man of resentment can only affirm himself by defining the masters as evil. But he has to hide his impotence, his natural weakness, his inability to act, to take revenge, to assert himself. It has to be stylized into a voluntary moral choice.
This is where concepts like free will and moral responsibility come in as necessary tools for the weak.
Exactly. They invent the idea that the master chooses to be strong and chooses to be cruel, and therefore could have chosen to be weak and humble.
So the slave claims moral credit for his lack of action by framing his weakness as a positive, voluntary accomplishment.
Precisely. His inability to take revenge is reinterpreted as voluntary accomplishment. Patience, humility, mercy, forgiveness, and specifically not wanting to take revenge. This is the workshop where ideals are fabricated, which Nietzsche famously and darkly declares stinks of lies.
It's a massive act of self-deception that allows the weak to feel morally superior to those who naturally express their strength.
Yes.
The analogy he uses with the lambs and the birds of prey drives this home perfectly, but what is its immediate practical implication for modern society?
Well, the analogy is devastatingly simple, isn't it? The lambs declare the birds of prey evil because the birds are strong and hunt. But Nietzsche argues it is absurd to ask strength not to express itself as strength.
Any more than asking weakness to express itself as strength.
Exactly. To ask it not to be a desire to overthrow and become master. The implication for modern society is that we have completely internalized the lamb's perspective. We passionately defend the belief that the strong, the successful, the active individual is morally free to choose weakness. And that gives us the right to blame them, judge them, and constrain them when they don't.
We've enshrined the moral right of the weak to restrain the strong.
The quantum of force, Nietzsche reminds us, is nothing but the driving, willing, and acting. To separate the actor from the deed, to say the lightning is separate from the flash, that's the fundamental linguistic trick of the slave.
And this battle of values isn't just a psychological trick. Nietzsche frames it as a concrete historical conflict that shaped the Western world, the battle between Rome and Judea.
This serves as the ultimate historical symbol for this ideological fight. Rome represents the aristocratic, powerful, life-affirming values. They were strong, proud. Rome saw the Jew, who represents priestly resentment, as an antipodia monster, convicted of hatred against the whole of mankind. Rome, the master, recognized the deep, negative, poisonous quality of this new value system.
And historically, this revolt of the weak was incredibly successful.
Unquestionably. I mean, 2 millennia of history show that the slaves' revolt, starting with the Jewish priestly caste and flowering in Christianity, has effectively defeated Rome. It has made everything appreciably Jewish, Christian, or plebeian.
The slave revolt in morality triumphed, and its values became the dominant, suffocating moral air we all breathe today.
But the classical ideal did occasionally reawaken. Nietzsche points to the Renaissance, which briefly broke the spell of Christian asceticism, and even later to the figure of Napoleon, whom he saw as a synthesis of Unmensch, the brute, raw power, and Übermensch, the overman.
A potential reawakening of classical ideals.
A reawakening, though maybe an unstable one. This ongoing conflict between these two systems remains the essential battleground of the higher nature today.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast. That leads us directly into Essay 2, where Nietzsche takes this historical critique and he focuses it inward, detailing the birth of conscience and its eventual turning into the bad conscience.
It starts with what he calls the paradoxical task, set by nature and culture, the monumental project of breeding an animal sanctioned to promise.
This is a huge physiological and cultural task because promising means being reliable, predictable, being able to bind your will to the future. To do that, man had to overcome a very powerful, very necessary physiological force, forgetfulness.
And forgetfulness, as Nietzsche points out, is not a flaw. It's an apparatus of suppression. It's what keeps us functional. The person whose forgetfulness is damaged can't cope with the endless, overwhelming flux of experience. To remember everything is to be paralyzed.
So for man to become a social creature, one who can make a contract and keep a promise, memory had to be engineered as a kind of counter device.
Yes, but not passive retention. It's the will's memory. It's an active desire not to let go of what was promised. And this required painful, violent cultural conditioning. Man had to learn complex cognitive functions like distinguishing accident from design, thinking causally, grasping ends and means, and becoming regular and predictable. This is the long history of the origins of responsibility.
And the ripest fruit of this long, difficult process is the sovereign individual.
This individual is autonomous and super-ethical, or übersinnlich, meaning they have gone beyond the mere morality of custom that governs the herd. They are the ultimate master of their own will. They have a strong, unbreakable, enduring will, capable of making and keeping promises no matter what. They have a proud consciousness of having achieved mastery over circumstances.
And this internal self-mastery gives him his absolute standard of value.
Absolutely. His dominant internal compass is what Nietzsche calls his conscience. It functions as his self-generated value system. This sovereign individual respects his peers, they're equally strong and reliable, and despises those who can't promise, who are fundamentally untrustworthy and weak. It's a powerful, confident internal standard rooted in strength.
But the conscience we usually talk about today, that feeling of guilt and moral torment, the bad conscience, that's a very different creature.
Very different. Nietzsche traces its origin through this violent linguistic and conceptual shift. He links the material and legal to the moral, debt to Guiltschulden to Schuld.
That linguistic connection between Schulden, material debt, and Schuld, moral guilt, is absolutely crucial.
It is. The oldest, most primitive relationship is buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. Debt, Schulden, was initially just a material concept rooted in restitution and exchange under equal power. It often required a calculated value of the injury, a limb for a failure to pay, for example.
And this is where Nietzsche brings in a deeply uncomfortable idea about the original function of punishment. It wasn't about moral retribution based on free will.
No. Punishment originated not as justice based on responsibility, but as a form of exchange and gratification for the creditor. Through punishment, the infliction of pain, the creditor participated in the rights of the masters. It was the warrant for, and an entitlement to, cruelty.
The suffering of the debtor compensated for the loss with the elevated feeling of maltreating and inferior.
This suggests that early punishment was a joyous event, not some solemn duty.
It was. Cruelty was a festive joy for the ancients, a profound physiological pleasure in exercising power and causing suffering. Modern man, the tame house pet, bred to abhor pain and discomfort, finds this idea revolting. But Nietzsche insists this enjoyment of cruelty was fundamental to early life and the formation of contracts. But the punitive relationship between creditor and debtor, while cruel, still doesn't explain the invention of the purely psychological, self-tormenting bad conscience.
No, the bad conscience is a dismal thing that came into the world through a violent, non-gradual breach with man's animal past. This happened when society, as a coercive political entity, was established. The confining spaces of society required the immediate suspension and devaluation of man's basic, primordial instincts, especially the will to power, aggression, and the instinct for freedom that were necessary in the wild.
Man was essentially caged, and this created a psychological catastrophe.
Correct. Lacking an external outlet for his aggressive energy, his will to power man was forced to turn this rapacious force inward. He is obliged to exercise that cruelty, that drive for mastery against himself. He gnawed at himself, suffered from himself, and became the inventor of the bad conscience, a sickness of man of himself that resulted from a forcible breach with his natural animal nature. The self-torment, the internalized guilt, is just the redirected force of the master instinct.
So, the guilt we feel today is simply our own aggression, turned toxic and inward because society denied it an external, healthy release. This sickness, however, reaches its most terrible and sublime peak through religious interpretation, the notion of debt towards God.
This transformation starts as the community grows in power. The concept of debt, Schuld, is passed from material obligations, debtor, to creditor, to obligations toward ancestors and founders, the community's gods. As the community's power increases, its respect and fear for its founders and gods also increase.
So the ancestor or God is ennobled, and eventually culminates in God being cast as the ultimate, supreme, unrepayable creditor.
The debt is no longer calculated in material terms, but in existential terms, and it grows exponentially with the success of the community itself.
The paradox here is horrifying. Man, by becoming more successful and civilized, accumulates a debt that becomes utterly unpayable.
Exactly. This debt consciousness becomes a terrifying psychological torture instrument. Man takes his natural animal instincts, his drives for mastery and freedom, and reinterprets them, under the guidance of the priestly class, as rebellion, insurrection, and animosity against God the Father, the ultimate ancestor.
He pits himself into this agonizing contradiction of God and devil.
And his illness, his sickness of himself, is transformed from a physical discomfort into a deeply moralized contradiction that pervades every moment of his life.
The genius of this psychological move is that this internal self-crucifixion is transformed into something so psychologically captivating and profound that it changes the whole character of the world. It makes suffering man seem like a great promise.
The focus shifts from outward action to inward suffering, and the depth of that suffering becomes a mark of his importance. The result is terrifying because even though life is now filled with deeper self-inflicted torment, it is now very interesting again. Man has discovered the source of his suffering in his own moral fault.
We move now to Essay 3, where Nietzsche asks the profound question that ties together his critique of history and psychology. What do ascetic ideals mean? The denial of the will, poverty, chastity, humility. What is the true function of these ideals?
For the artist, he suggests, these ideals are often misunderstood or just used as a mask. He uses the example of Richard Wagner's later work, Parsifal, and his strange, late homage to chastity. Nietzsche wonders if this is a tragic self-denial, an apostasy from the sensual affirmation of life, or just a temporary artistic device.
Because the artist, at their best, is concerned with the highest intellectualization and sensualization of life, so a serious turn to asceticism is philosophically catastrophic.
But when we turn to philosophers and scholars, their partiality toward the ascetic ideal, poverty, humility, chastity, it seems inherent to their function, doesn't it?
Undeniably. The philosopher's instinct drives them to create the optimum condition for Geistigkeit, the highest intellectuality or spirituality. The ascetic life is a necessary, practical means to power and productivity, not an end in itself. The philosopher is trying to create an environment where sustained, deep thought is even possible, and this often means avoiding external disturbances, especially marriage and sensuality.
They abhor things that hinder this path noise: women, family life, social obligations. The source material notes that figures like Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, they were all unmarried. Nietzsche jokes that a married philosopher belongs to comedy.
So their adoption of asceticism is purely utilitarian for their intellectual needs, not a moral virtue.
They are not virtues, but the most proper and natural prerequisites for their best existence and finest productivity. It is a necessary means to achieve intellectual mastery. Think about Schopenhauer. He interpreted Kant's idea of aesthetic contemplation without interest in a deeply personal way.
As a counter-device to sexual interestedness.
Yes, praising it as an escape from the all-consuming will. Nietzsche suggests Schopenhauer's entire philosophical system, the idea of redemption through art and denying the will, might just be a generalization of his own specific, perhaps painful sexual experience or his psychological need for relief.
The key thread here is that the philosopher pays homage to the ascetic ideal because ultimately he wants to free himself from torture, the torture of the physical, the emotional, the unpredictable.
The ascetic life provides psychological relief, a zone of peace necessary for intellectual effort.
But this raises that apparent contradiction. The ascetic ideal appears to be life against life, life willing its own denial.
And Nietzsche dismisses this as physiological nonsense. Life, by definition, cannot truly will its own non-existence. The idea of uninterestedness, or nirvana, is a mere word wedged into an old gap in human knowledge.
So what is the real state of affairs? We have to reverse the interpretation.
The real state is the reverse. The ascetic ideal springs not from strength, but from the protective and healing instincts of a degenerating life. It's a trick, a Kunstgriff, an artifice or ingenious device for the preservation of life, struggling against existential disgust, exhaustion, and the wish for the end in the sick animal man. The fact that this ideal was able to rule man globally reveals the profound sickliness of the human type that has existed up to now.
It's a necessary lie that saves humanity from nihilism. And here enters the most powerful figure of the ideal, the ascetic priest.
The priest acts as the master magician, a necessary figure who manages and heals widespread physiological sickliness within the herd. He is a negating one in his doctrines, denying the world, the body, the senses. Yet paradoxically, he belongs to the really great conserving and, yes, creating forces of life.
Why conserving?
Because he gives the sick man a meaning when he would otherwise succumb to self-destruction and nihilism. He prevents suicidal nihilism by giving humanity a goal, even if that goal is painful morality.
And how does he manage this massive sick crowd? He must use their own bottled-up resentment against them.
That is his primary function. His prime trick is to detonate the explosive material of resentment piling up in the herd. He does this by interpreting the sick man's suffering in religious, moral, or metaphysical terms, bringing it within the perspective of guilt or sinfulness.
He tells the sick man, "You are not sick because life is suffering, but because you are guilty."
And he achieves this using what Nietzsche calls guilty methods, ways to produce an excess of feeling as a kind of spiritual anesthetic.
The priest is brilliant in thinking out how to achieve these intense, overwhelming sensations.
Yes, excess of feeling functions as the most effective anesthetic for dull, long drawn-out physiological pain. These methods include exciting violent emotions like fear or ecstasy, instituting penitential torments like flagellation and fasting, and inducing spasms of redemption.
This practice is called guilty because it often makes the sick sicker, physically and spiritually.
But it achieves the ultimate goal. It makes life very interesting again. The man, the sinner, is no longer plagued by dull, meaningless pain, but by the extremes of fear, agony, and the cry for redemption. They are saved from existential boredom. They thirst for pain because it is meaningful pain.
The ultimate triumph for the priest is that, though life is more poisonous and filled with deeper suffering, man is saved because he had a meaning.
The intensity overcomes the lethargy and the temptation of nihilism. The priest may have ruined the spiritual health of Europeans, but he saved them from the ultimate despair.
If the ascetic ideal is fundamentally about providing meaning and a life-preserving illusion, how does Nietzsche view its most profound modern manifestation, science?
This is the final, profound twist of the genealogy. Science itself, with its relentless, uncompromising will to truth, is often the most unconscious, involuntary, secret, and subterranean ally of the ascetic ideal.
Why? Science prides itself on being objective, rational, and explicitly anti-metaphysical.
But our faith in truth, this uncompromising demand that truth should be pursued at all costs, regardless of consequences, is still based on a metaphysical faith that we inherit directly from the Christian God. This faith is inherently ascetic because it denies the world of life, appearance, and deception. It demands an intellectual stoicism that denies the world of effects and interpretation, aiming for an impossible eye turned in no direction at all, a view that Nietzsche says is physiologically absurd.
That inherent rejection of the world of flux and appearance is fundamentally ascetic.
And for many modern scholars and diligent workers, science provides a kind of self-anesthetic. It's a way to avoid the larger, terrifying questions of meaning. Their unreflective diligence and mastery of craft function as an attempt to conceal something from themselves and avoid consciousness.
He diagnoses this as the disquiet of the lack of ideals itself.
Yes, the suffering that results from a lack of great love, a lack of meaning, which they try to fill with endless, small, quantifiable tasks.
So, the famous victories of science detaching itself from morality and metaphysics, they haven't conquered the ascetic ideal. They've just made it stronger by turning its denial inward and making it appear utterly rational and inevitable.
It has made it more elusive, more spiritual, and more insidious. The ultimate modern dilemma emerges from this realization. When faith in the God of the ascetic ideal is denied, which modern science constantly tries to do, the value of truth itself must ultimately be called into question. The will to truth needs a critique, because if truth is simply the ultimate form of self-denial, then maybe life, appearance, and interpretation are more valuable than truth itself. This leads to the ultimate question of the value of value.
To fully appreciate the scope of Nietzsche's world affirmation, we should step back and look briefly at his earlier, highly provocative essays that shaped his political and cultural perspective, particularly the Greek state and Homer's contest. This material really forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? Especially about the relationship between high culture and social stratification.
The ancient Greeks, Nietzsche notes, had no need for the conceptual hallucinations that define our modern era, like the dignity of man or the dignity of work. He calls these feeble products of a slavery that hides from itself. The Greeks openly viewed work as a disgrace because existence in itself had no inherent value. It only had value insofar as it was consumed by art, by the creation of genius.
And this leads to his cruel-sounding truth about the necessary foundations of culture, a premise that is impossible to reconcile with modern liberal thought.
Yes, this is the terrible premise of culture. Slavery belongs to its essence. For a broad, deep, fertile soil for the development of art, the overwhelming majority must be slavishly subjected to necessity to toil and drudgery, to serve a minority, and their extra time and freedom allow for the Olympian existence and the creation of high artistic culture. He states it bluntly. The misery of the toil-worn majority must be increased to make the world of art possible for a few.
So the state, in this view, is not a benevolent institution created to protect everyone from the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all.
Far from it. Nietzsche sees the state not as a protective measure, but as an iron clamp that produces society by force to achieve a single, higher cultural goal: the constantly renewed creation and preparation of the genius.
This completely redefines the dignity of the individual.
It does. Under this aristocratic ideal, man only possesses dignity, rights, and duties as a completely determined being serving unconscious purposes. That is, serving the eventual creation and nourishment of genius. Plato's ideal state, in this view, is a wonderfully grand hieroglyph of this necessary, ruthless connection between the state and the birth of cultural greatness.
And the Greek spirit was defined by this ruthless striving for greatness, which wasn't always aimed at conquering external enemies, but at perfecting themselves through internal conflict.
That's the essence of the Hellenic idea of competition, or agon, which he analyzes in Homer's Contest. The Greek is openly envious, thonos, but this envy is viewed not as a vice, but as a necessary natural drive. It channels men toward a contest rather than a destructive struggle to the death.
Wait, so Nietzsche's arguing that envy can be a positive, culturally productive force. That runs completely contrary to the slave morality we just discussed, which deems envy sinful.
It is absolutely contrary to slave morality, which tries to eradicate all feelings of inadequacy or rivalry. For Nietzsche, properly channeled, envy is essential. The kernel of the Hellenic idea of competition is that it loathes a monopoly of predominance. It fears the danger of one genius dominating.
It requires a second genius as a protective measure against the first.
Yes, the purpose of the agon is to incite each other to action while simultaneously keeping each other within strict productive limits. It forces perpetual self-overcoming.
This creates a self-regulating system of cultural excellence. What happens when that internal contest disappears?
The sources show that the decline of Athens and Sparta, after they achieved immense victories, demonstrates this danger. When they become hors de concours, out of the competition, when they have no worthy rival, they start to deteriorate internally. They become evil and cruel, vengeful and godless. They revert to pre-Homeric savagery. Without this internal contest, this noble envy, the Hellenic state deteriorates because the internal pressure for excellence is removed.
We contrast this aggressive, aristocratic, culture-creating political ideal with what Nietzsche sees as the inherent danger of modern political systems. They strive for the antithesis of the agon, peaceful coexistence.
He views the dominant modern movement, democratic, liberal, socialistic, as intrinsically linked to the fear of war and the widespread dissemination of a liberal, optimistic worldview. And this worldview, he argues, is largely engineered by a self-seeking, stateless money aristocracy who see the state purely as a means to undisturbed coexistence. It allows them to pursue their own aims without restriction or danger.
They want the state to be entirely rational, predictable, and risk-averse, a safe vehicle for their own collective egoism and pursuit of comfort.
Exactly. And this leads to the decline of man into the mediocrity of desires. This results directly in what Nietzsche calls the herd animal morality and political decay. He worries that in losing our fear of man, we have lost our love, respect, hope, and even our will to be man, which he identifies as the essence of nihilism today.
The political system is simply a mirror of the dominant moral decay into comfortable mediocrity. Okay, so to summarize the essential statements, the key takeaways from our deep dive into Nietzsche's critique of morality.
First, morality is not an eternal sacred truth. It's an invented system rooted in profound incorporated errors, primarily our lack of self-knowledge and our refusal to accept our animal nature.
Second, the core moral values of good and evil originated in a revolutionary shift. The slaves' revolt in morality, driven by resentment, that inwardly festering hatred and vengefulness against the spontaneous, life-affirming, noble valuation of the masters.
Third, the feeling of guilt, Schuld, is a sophisticated moral construct. It evolved from the purely material concept of debt, Schulden, and was transformed into an inward-turned sickness. It became a self-inflicted torture mechanism used by religious authority to interpret human suffering, channeling man's aggressive instincts against himself.
And fourth, the ascetic ideal. The denial of the will and the senses is not fundamentally life-denying. It's a profound, necessary, life-preserving trick, a Kunstgriff. It provided suffering man with the ultimate meaning when none existed, saving him from suicidal nihilism, even if it introduced deeper psychological torment in the process. And that brings us to the final provocative thought, building on that conclusion about the ascetic ideal's meaning. The ideal was the ultimate foutu mieux par excellence, the best option available to prevent humanity from simply giving up. It provided meaning, filling the enormous emptiness after the death of God.
The essential question facing us now is what comes next. The will itself was saved by the ascetic ideal man could will something no matter what or how. But now that we're questioning the foundation of that ideal, we face the same danger of meaninglessness.
The only ideal that remains, the relentless will to truth manifested in modern science, is itself simply the ascetic ideal in its strictest, most dangerous form, denying the world of life, appearance, and deception in favor of cold, objective reality.
The ultimate challenge facing the good Europeans is the necessity of a transvaluation of values, finding a new meaning, a new value system strong enough to affirm life and counter nihilism without resorting to the comforting yet deadly errors of the past.
The profound, lingering question is whether we can bear the weight of such responsibility and create values born of strength, not resentment. A question well worth ruminating on. Thank you for diving deep with us today.